Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. For one instant to dwell in the presence of the galaxies. For one instant to live in the truth of the heart. The poet says this entire traveling cosmos is the secret one, slowly growing a body. Two eagles are mating, clasping each other's claws and turning cartwheels in the sky. Grasses are blooming, grandfathers dying, consciousness blinking on and off. All of this is happening at once. All of this vibrating into existence, every particle foaming into existence, transcribing the ineffable. Every particle foaming into existence, transcribing the ineffable. Arising and passing away, arising and passing away. 23 trillion times per second. When Buddha saw that, he smiled. 16 million tons of rain are falling every second on the planet. An ocean perpetually falling, and every drop is your body. Every motion, every feather, every thought is your body. Time is your body. And the infinite, curled inside like invisible rainbows folded into light. Every word of every tongue is love, telling a story to her own ears. Every word of every tongue is love, telling a story to her own ears. Let our lives be incense, burning like a hymn to the sacred body of the universe. My religion is rain. My religion is stone. My religion reveals itself to me in sweaty epiphanies. Every leaf, every river, every animal, your body. Every creature trapped in the gears of corporate nightmares. Every species made extinct was once your body. 10 million people are dreaming that they're flying. Junipers and violets are blossoming, stars exploding and being born. God is having deja vu. I am one elaborate crush. We cry petals as the void is singing. You are the dark that holds the stars in intimate distance, that spun the whirling, whirling world into existence. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. Thank you. Thank you all so much. That's a poem called Hymn to the Sacred Body of the Universe that I wrote. And a lot of my poetry is inspired by a great mentor who I had. When I was about 20 years old and starting college, I encountered the work of Thomas Berry, who's a cosmological thinker, an environmental writer, and essayist. And I'll skip the story, but basically Thomas Berry became my mentor for the last 20 years of his life, and that was a great blessing. So my perspective was deeply shaped by Thomas Berry's cosmological vision. And I don't need to tell this room, but when I present out in the mainstream, I often cosmology is a word that people are not familiar with, so I have to say that, you know, cosmology is a study of the origin and development of the universe as a whole. But the cosmology is also the worldview that a culture has. A cosmology is the story that a culture tells itself about how the world came to be and how we fit into it. So kind of imbibing the perspective of Thomas Berry, I began to feel that the ecological crisis, you know, what Berry was saying is that the ecological crisis is a crisis of story. There's been a dysfunctional cosmology that's been operating in Western civilization. And then it's a cosmology that has seen, that has been anthropocentric, human-centered. It's seen the human as separate from nature, and it has placed all of the value and all of the rights with the human, and no rights and no value with nature or the more than human realm. And so you have this kind of, you know, and Berry can, you know, Berry goes into, you know, some of the ways that this happened, kind of our inheritance of Western civilization from the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and how that kind of anthropocentric strain in that tradition then gets amplified even further when it connects with the dualism of Greek Hellenistic tradition. So in that kind of Hellenistic Greek tradition, you have a separation of matter and spirit. And this gets amplified again through, you know, the scientific revolution and the thinking of Descartes, and to the idea that the world loses its soul, and that the world becomes a disenchanted place. And that, so part of, I think, what is happening now, and part of why a conference like this is so significant, is because we're at a place where we're ready to gather the best of the wisdom of science, connect it to the best of our traditions, our indigenous traditions, our goddess-centered traditions, our classical religious traditions, so that we're in an exciting moment of really restoring our human civilization on the planet. And it's not going to be a single story. I love the quote from John Berger, who said, "Never again will a single story be told as if it is the only one." But I think there is some coherences that are emerging, and again, they're very ancient. So a lot of the wisdom that we need is ancient wisdom, and yet we need the cutting-edge wisdom of science. Thomas Berry wrote an essay called The Fourfold Wisdom, where he said, you know, we need the wisdom of indigenous traditions, we need the wisdom of women, we need the wisdom of the classical religious traditions at their best, and we need the wisdom of science. And so I think that is something more like in a kind of Western framework where we've had such a tendency toward colonialism and imperialism, and even intellectual and scholarly colonialism and imperialism. We need to bring, and the imperialism of the rational mental mode. So there's a shadow side of science. There's a disrespectful side of science. There's a colonial dimension or dynamic in the way science has, you know, enforced itself around the globe. But I think this conference is so significant because we are bringing science back into the proper perspective, joining it with our wisdom traditions to create a new kind of postmodern wisdom. And so I think this conference on science and non-duality is incredibly important, and I thank you for the heart and the intellect and the rigor and the appreciation of mystery that you're all bringing to this gathering. What I want to talk about in the brief time that I have, and I'm going to do plenty more poems too, so my time for comments is really brief, but I want to talk about cosmology, ecology, poetry, and justice as sciences of interconnection, if you will. And so it was really through the cosmological perspective of Thomas Berry that I began to think about in terms of non-duality. I mean, Thomas Berry would say that the universe is a single energy event. The universe is a single, though multiform, energy event. And so I was listening to this great sage, Thomas Berry, and I was going like, and listening to other people who have interpreted his work and shared his work, such as Brian Swim and many others, that we are the universe. I mean, it's such a simple thing, but it's such a powerful thing. That the universe expresses itself in the myriad forms. So that the universe, and that is not just a physical unfolding. You know, this is one of Thomas Berry's great insights from the work of Teilhard de Chardin, that the universe from the beginning is a psychic spiritual unfolding as well as a physical material unfolding. So, this was covered, quite well yesterday. But it's not that, but I remember I'm flashing back, listening to all this wisdom from this conference and flashing back to things that Thomas Berry told me 20 years ago, where he said human consciousness is not an addendum or an intrusion into a previously unconscious universe. But human consciousness is an expression of the consciousness of the universe, the consciousness that's inherent in the process from the very beginning. So that as the galaxies are swirling themselves into being, spirit, intelligence, wisdom, consciousness is present. In the early Earth, it's a boiling orb of molten lava for its first billion years. Consciousness is present. It's just the universe is a seamless process. It's a seamless process of unfolding. So if there is spirit, if there is poetry, if there is creative mystery, if there is sacredness around us now, that humans build temples, we have mystics, we have shamanic initiations, we have spirituality. So if there is human spirituality, it must be that the human is activating the spiritual dynamics of the universe that were present from the very beginning. And so I think if the entire universe is conscious, then it overcomes this Cartesian split between, I'm a real observer with a soul and consciousness, and I'm observing a world that is dead, inanimate, material. And so I think part of what we need to do here is is just to work out both the practical and philosophical dimensions of what it means, to live in a conscious, alive universe in which every being is equally real, conscious, a person, if you will, or it has some, person's not quite the right word because it implies humanness. But part of what I'm trying to do is show some of the connections between social justice and ecology, based on deep principles that I think are common to both social justice and ecology and cosmology, for that matter. So one of these deep principles, I think, is the sacred personhood of every being. Thomas Berry's ethical formula is that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. The universe is composed of subjects to be communed with, rather than objects to be exploited. So it doesn't matter what, every person is of course a sacred being, but every animal is a sacred being, every plant is a sacred being, every ecosystem has its own sacredness. So I think that this idea of, Dr. Martin Luther King and the Black Church had this tradition of somebodyness. Every being is a somebody. Every atom is an I am. Every ecosystem, every raindrop, every particle has its divinity. And so we need to understand that, and we need to act and live from that place. And that's what ecology, that's what a functional ecology, Thomas Berry once said that ecology is functional cosmology. How do we take this cosmic unity? How do we take this cosmic truth that every being is divine, and how do we make it functional with the way we live on this planet and creating a sustainable, self-renewing, planetary, harmonious human Earth civilization onward into the future? Ecology is functional cosmology. And so when you have a cosmology of non-duality, we need ecology to make it functional and practical in our day-to-day lives. And I would say the same thing for social justice. Social justice is what love looks like in practice. Social justice is what non-duality looks like in the rough and tumble, real, day-to-day world, right? So I think this principle of respecting the sacredness of every being, there's no, does that mean you don't eat meat? I mean, how we actually work that out is something, that's going to require a lot. But I think we need to be moving in the direction of what are the deep principles that connect ecology and social justice. And I think celebrating the sacred personhood of every being is one of those. I think community is another deep principle that connects ecology, social justice, cosmology. Community, the primacy of relationship. Okay, before I get too talky, let me read another poem. This poem, I'll use this poem to segue into a couple remarks about poetry and non-duality. But since Rumi was mentioned, I will. This is a poem that I wrote in honor of Rumi. Rumi, the first whirling saint of poetry, spinning like a galaxy, weaving constellations of words like blazing stars, numinous moons, planets with gardens blossoming, and oceans floating in space. Rumi, the first whirling saint of poetry, traversing the geography of divine desire with longing stronger than the undertow of history. This presence is mysterious, like the silhouette of music, the circumference of a dream. When Rumi met Shams, the clouds couldn't keep quiet. They cried at the question that knocked Rumi down. They floated more slowly, hoping to hear whispers from their mystical conversations. Rumi, sending words like flaming arrows to penetrate hearts cold as that December night when Shams was called to the back door, never to be seen again. Rumi, bathed in sacred graces. Rumi, bathed in sacred graces like the wind that fills the flute with notes of longing. I saw Rumi spinning verses in the early morning hours, one arm wrapped around the pillar, his free hand tracing outlines of angels in the air. Songs with the power to intoxicate prophets, longing for the beloved whose absence fills the world. Invisible odes built of breath, like God could kiss your lips and transmit words that ride on waves of how it feels when you're together. Thank you. So with poetry, we also see, you see, I was talking to Maurizio months ago, and I was saying, no, it's really all about non-duality. He's like, I know, I get it, that's why I've got it, that's why I'm doing the conference, it's all about. I think non-duality, the essence of non-duality flows through cosmology, flows through ecology, flows through social justice, and flows through poetry. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. The poetic moment is a moment of overcoming oneself and breaking into authentic connection with the world. And so that subject-object dualism between the observer and something observed breaks down in the poetic instant. There's actually a term, the haiku moment. The haiku moment. There's a book out, in fact, called The Haiku Moment. And the haiku moment has been linked to, you know, Satori or these other instances of awakening. And here's a quote. Here's an author who's basically quoting D.T. Suzuki saying, Satori is not a vision of a detached onlooker. Instead of subject-object duality that characterizes Here, instead of subject-object duality that characterizes our day-to-day experience, there is some kind of dynamic involvement between the subject and the object in the Satori state. So we can understand that as roughly equivalent to what some of these authors are talking about when they talk about the haiku moment. And the great poet and monk Basho wrote, "Your poetry issues of its own accord when you and the object have become one. When you have plunged deeply enough into the object to see something like a hidden glimmering there. However well phrased your poetry may be, if your feeling is not natural, if the object and yourself are separate, then your poetry is not true poetry." And so an example from the Western tradition, you know, we have the poet John Keats. Keats said, "A poet is the most unpoetical thing in existence because he has no identity. The setting sun will always set me to rights, and if a sparrow come before my window, I take part in its existence and pick about the gravel." That's poetry. I take part in its existence. There's a great Native American verse that says, "He, the blackbird, he am I." Thich Nhat Hanh, great Vietnamese monk, says, "If you were a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist." But it's that first line, "If you are a poet, you will see clearly that all things are interconnected." And so I think the path of poetry, the path of social justice, the path of ecology, the path of cosmology is about perceiving that all things are connected and then making that real in our lives individually and collectively. You know, Thomas Berry once said, to tell the story of anything, you have to tell the story of everything. And so I take poetry seriously as a mode of knowing, in the same way that I take spiritual practice seriously as a mode of knowing. You know, I think that's part of why I mentioned the fourfold wisdom, is because I think, you know, there are other modes of knowing. I don't have to tell the people in this room, but science, you know, empirical observation and repeatable experiments is not the only modes of knowing that we need. We need access to all of these deep wisdoms. John Mohawk, a Native American scholar, said, "Poetry gives us as much information about our relationship with the universe as telescopes do." And so let me read a poem that there's a line in here that actually makes me think of that. This is a poem called "Hieroglyphic Stairway." It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, "What did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew?" I'm riding home on the Colma train. I've got the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I have teams of scientists feeding me data daily and pleading I immediately turn it into poetry. I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech. I am the desirous earth, equidistant to the underworld and the flesh of the stars. I am everything already lost. The moment the universe turns transparent and all the light shoots through the cosmos, I use words to instigate silence. I'm a hieroglyphic stairway in a buried Mayan city, suddenly exposed by a hurricane, a satellite circling Earth, finding dinosaur bones in the Gobi Desert. I am telescopes that see back in time. I'm the precession of the equinoxes, the magnetism of the spiraling sea. I'm riding home on the Colma train with the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I am myths where violets blossom from blood like dying and rising gods. I'm the boundary of time, soul encountering soul and tongues of fire. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I can't sleep because my great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, "What did you do while the earth was unraveling?" I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech. Thank you. I think non-duality and this oneness, this interconnection, and the sacredness of every being is a theme that runs through all of these different areas. Martin Luther King Jr. I think one of the things that I'm working on, I'm writing a doctoral dissertation right now in which I'm exploring some of these links between ecology, social justice, and cosmology. And one of the things that I'm really excited about bringing forward is that I think there's a cosmological dimension to Martin Luther King Jr. that has been underappreciated. We appreciate his theology. You know, he's rooted in theology. He comes from Black Baptist tradition, this and that. But I think there's also a cosmological dimension that's been underappreciated. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. He says, Dr. King says quite clearly, the universe is on the side of justice. The universe is on the side of justice. Now, he could have said God is on the side of justice. He could have said Jesus is on the side of justice. He could have said the Old Testament prophets are on the side of justice. But he chose to say the universe is on the side of justice. And he didn't just say it once. He said, I found at least 7 examples where he says the universe is on the side of justice. He also says we have cosmic companionship in the struggle for justice. So I think there is a cosmological dimension to King beyond his theological orientation that we need to recover and appreciate. There is also, I would say, an ecological dimension to King. Now that may seem strange. King died 2 years before the popular explosion of ecological consciousness. But when you read his writings, when you go back, first of all, we treat King in a very superficial way, you know. So we trot out a couple of lines from the I Have a Dream speech, you know, once a year, and we go, oh yeah, we all know about Martin Luther King. But we don't. There's actually a tremendous richness when you go back and you look at his sermons, you look at his speeches, particularly the last 5 years of his life that were so just off the chain, radical and fiery and prophetic that our culture doesn't even want to deal with it. So we freeze him in 1963 giving the I Have a Dream speech, and we kind of ignore his most fiery, radical and prophetic years, which are the last 5 years of his life. So if I can quickly just kind of as a scholar and researcher say, get excited about rediscovering some of the work of Dr. King, and get really excited when you see a passage from 1967, when you see a passage from 1968. He only lived 4 months into 1968. When you see King from 67, from 68, you're seeing King at the height of his radical prophetic powers. And so during this time, one of the very last talks that he gave in the last months of his life, he said, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Just a few sentences later in the same speech, he said, this is the way our universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. So, you know, I don't have time to go into it much more than that, but I would just say there's an ecological dimension to Martin Luther King. There's a cosmological dimension to Martin Luther King. And so I think these issues of reverence, respect for the sanctity of every being, of every entity, of all phenomena, and these issues of community are core principles that flow through ecology, justice, and cosmology. Let's take a couple of questions. And okay, great. Let's see if there's some questions or comments, anything people want to touch on. There's a gentleman over here.
You mentioned John Keats. Keats talked about negative capability, that a poet needs negative capability, by which he meant the ability to relate to the unknown and what he can't relate to. Does that play a part as you... I say this because this has been the most amazing conference. I'm just stunned by this conference. But there's almost a sense of sureness that we know about non-duality, which I think is true, but I'm wondering if a poet's role isn't then to take the part that's more unknowable and just feel that and be with that in Keats' sense of negative capability.
I think that's really important. I think humility is an appropriate response to the mysteries that we're surrounded by, and the mysteries beyond us and within us. And so I think part of why we need poetry is because we can't always capture mystery in prose. We can't always capture mystery in an equation. We can't always capture mystery and that's where the fecundity is, with the mystery. You know, if you talk about the creative process, one of my colleagues, Richard Tarnas, talks about how part of what the artist is doing is connecting the conscious mind to the unconscious. And, you know, that's one reason why artists and writers and musicians can sometimes over-rely on drugs, you know, or alcohol and things like this, because they're trying to create a communication between the conscious mind and the unconscious. Because the mystery, the power, the creativity, the brilliance, the genius is in the unconscious. And so part of why poetry is so important is because we need the kind of tricks of poetry, whether it's the surprise or the apparent paradox. You know, it's like when mystics try to convey their experience and they find themselves speaking in paradoxes. There are certain experiences where paradox is about as close as you're going to get. You know, so it's poetry is absolutely, you know, so in my poetry sometimes, I'll give you a quick example. You know, in the poem that I just read, there's got parts of it, you know, that are very much about the ecological crisis and the mass extinction crisis, you know, the planet's unraveling and this sort of thing. And then there's kind of the way that I had envisioned the poem was that it's about an individual waking up in the middle of the night, feeling the weight of the ecological crisis, but also and it's an individual that's riding home on a train. But then there are these intrusions of cosmic consciousness, you know, so I am the precession of the equinoxes, you know, I am telescopes that see back in time. So part of what I was trying to do was convey some, and there's a great group, fantastic group called the Pachamama Alliance, and they've used parts of that poem in a symposium that they use that talks about ecological and social justice issues. And they came to me and they said, do you mind if we just kind of use the first part of that poem? And I said, that's totally fine, because I get it. You know, if you're trying to create an ecological message, you don't want necessarily the kind of trippy, hallucinogenic parts about, like, I am myths that where violets blossom from blood. Like, how does that tell me how to move forward around ecological issues? You see what I'm saying? So there's a quote that says, art does not like to lie down in the bed that is made for it. You see, they had their ecological program, they want to move people into action, and they said, can we just use this part? Because art does not like to lie down in the bed that is made for it. But for me as an artist, and so it was great, I'm happy for them to use the ecological parts. But for me as an artist, I'm trying to convey all the mystery. You see what I'm saying? Not just that the planet's going to hell and we need to do something about it, though I certainly. So that kind of didactic, as an artist, I'm trying to balance some kind of didactic, political, and ecological messages with language that evokes the mystery. You see what I'm saying? Thank you for that. Do you have another question or comment?
We've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Let's have another question or comment, and then I can close with a poem.
Not a question, just an observation that I feel that Walt Whitman is right by your side.
Oh, honored to have Uncle Walt in vogue. Thank you.
One more question? Or do you want to...
One more question?
Can you help us connect a little bit more to the social justice ethic of your great-grandchildren's vision? Because I see the weakness of Advaita tradition is it hasn't produced a strong social justice ethic historically in India. And I think it's a lacking dimension.
Right. I think we need more people who are bringing spirituality and social justice together, and bringing Advaita and social justice together. And I think the reason why we all go gaga over Gandhi and Martin Luther King, you know, and so this is something as a scholar I got interested in, you know, about 10 years ago. I said, people say, Gandhi, oh, he's so great. King, he's so great. And I wanted to know, okay, is this just like good PR, you know, and storytelling? Or, so I went back and I read my Gandhi, or read some, you know, the guy wrote 80 volumes, you know. But I read some Gandhi and I read Martin Luther King, and I said, I get it. I get it. I see why people lump King and Gandhi together, and I see why people celebrate King and Gandhi, because they were really taking this spiritual perspective into the rough and tumble world of how do we deal with poverty, how do we deal with 400 years of white supremacy, you know, on the North American continent. So I think that we have to be that real as Gandhi, you know, and yet at the same time, there's a kind of California I don't want to disparage it, but there's a kind of new agey spiritual approach that says, oh, I don't want to hear about anything negative, and let's just use the power of intention and focus on the forward. And there's a way in which, and I believe in the power of intention, and I believe in accentuating the positive, but I don't believe in denial. I don't believe in using a spiritual stance as an excuse for denial. And so I think that when we're talking about these deep issues of imperialism, imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy, systemic racism, misogyny, patriarchy, these are spiritual diseases. I mean, they have very practical effects, but these are ultimately spiritual, symptoms. And so I think that we have to be as incisive and as courageous in our approach to social justice as we are in our spiritual lives, and not let a spiritual pose cover over kind of white people and privileged people not dealing with racism and privilege. And this, you see what I'm saying? So I think that this is why King and Gandhi are so significant, because they're able to hold the spirituality and the depth of critique. They're able to hold the love and the actual looking. There's nothing spiritual about denial. There's nothing spiritual about creating excuses and rationalizations for injustice and discrimination and unfair policies. So I think that we need to break. So that's why I think Gandhi and King are so significant as role models, and that we need to activate the Gandhi and the King inside each of us and in our communities as we move forward, and that this is really the crux of how we need to move forward. I need to close with a poem. So thank you for that question. I think it's absolutely important. I'll just close with two really short poems. First one is called The Heart and the World. This is a new one. It's on the paper. And I do have a poetry book and a CD. Actually, I'm going to do a book signing at 6:30 after this session, so I'd love to say hi to some folks, and if you want to purchase a book or a CD. This is called The Heart and the World. The heart is a begging bowl. The world is a luminous coyote. The heart, a mad genius. The world, a standing wave. The world is a goddess of energy. The heart is a monolith on the moon. The heart is aquatic. The world is promiscuous. The heart is a problematic documentarian. The world is a God-drunk flood of physics. The world is an echo. The heart, a child soldier. The heart is a burning bush. And here's just one last one to close, short one. This is called Revision. Open your eyes. See visions. Imagine a melody infinitely. Listen. A planet of stories with islands of silence. Her curved surface radiates grace. Milky Way blazing in the sky above the city. Speaking in fractals, the stars are telepathic. Wake the poets. Wake the dreamers. Cultivate the tendrils in the vineyard of your heart. Reorient our buildings to the solstice. And from the center of the city, see the stars. Thanks, Marita.
Thank you, Drew.
I love you.
See, that's what we are talking about, looking at the navel, at the glass half empty. I always had this with Zaya, we have this idea that we developed, this idea. If we are all one, if we are one organism, wouldn't the hand go and help the foot when it's hurt? When we see our ocean destroyed, when we see our water, when we see our planet destroyed by our action, wouldn't part of this organism go in and help without doubt, without any questions? We're gonna, in time, I will have the honor of have you back, we will bring more ecology. We want to bring more activism. Yes. No, that's what we need. We live a day-to-day life. Non-duality is an amazing thing. It's an amazing approach to understand and deal with human suffering, with our issue, with our core being. And as Francis said, to be happy. But once we are happy, we have to do something. Otherwise, it gets boring to be happy.